Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Francis Tapon. I'm here with Matt Weinzierl. He is currently at HBS, which is Harvard Business School. He is just finishing a book, or just it's going to come out. When's the date? Is it February?
February 25th, and there it is, right in the background there.
Yes, Space to Grow. And this book is a book that I've actually been dreaming somebody would write. And if nobody wrote it, I was going to write it. But thank God you wrote it. And it is an amazing book. I love space and space technology and all that kind of stuff, but most of the books don't talk about the business side of space. And that's exactly what you delve into. Right now, you're at Harvard Business School. If you had a bunch of students say, we want to be entrepreneurs, we want to start a new idea, what would you tell them? Here are some low-hanging fruits to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. And first of all, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show, and really love what you're doing with it, and really glad to speak with your listening audience. I know they're or watching audience too. I hope they share your enthusiasm for space. So let me just say one thing about the course, which is so great and probably reflects also your audience's interest. We've been teaching about space now at Harvard Business School for a few years, and the number of students, MBA students, interested in this sector just keeps growing, almost by a factor of two each year. And I think we could put 200 students in the room this year. It's lighting people on fire because it's the kind of thing where it's technical, it's sophisticated, but you really feel like you can make a positive impact on the world. It's one of those almost inherently optimistic things to get involved in. So it's just a joy to be a part of it. And a lot of them do want to start space companies, just like you're saying, whether they want to do it now or in a few years or whatever. And some of them have started companies out of HBS. We could even talk about a couple of those startups. But you asked about sort of areas, and that's a great place to start because I'm really eager. We're always eager to get people thinking about how they might get involved in space. And let me give you a couple of different ones. So maybe in starting with the most practical. So by far, the vast majority of money to be made in space, business to be had in space, even impact really in the short term is through satellites. So it's data from satellites about Earth, or it's data through satellites with internet connectivity and communications. Most of your listeners will probably have heard of Starlink, the big satellite constellation that SpaceX is putting up into space of many, many thousands of broadband internet satellite constellations or a constellation. And the implications of that for business are actually a little bit hard, I think, even to quite foresee, right? You imagine connectivity that is not just for our phones, but for your cars or for other mobile devices. As that grows, there's a ton of potential applications for that technology and ways to imagine knowing your own business, how you might use that to serve your customers better. There's also a lot of work going on to figure out how to make those satellite constellations function better. And it's often called in-space servicing or satellite servicing. So how do we refuel satellites? How do we update satellites? How do we move satellites in ways that can extend their use and make them more powerful? So there's all sorts of things going on in that sector.
And a lot of people
Uh,
may not think about that. When they think of space, they're thinking of going to the moon or space
exactly.
hotels and that kind of stuff. But they don't think about space looking back on our planet as opposed to looking out to the
Exactly.
stars. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I mean, uh, well, let me talk about the ones that are looking out a little further, because I think that's important too, right? There's the near term, which is data and satellites. If we look just maybe a bit over the horizon, there's a really exciting new thing happening in space, which is a shift from the International Space Station, which has been housing astronauts for over 2 decades now and continuous presence in space. It's done wonderful things, but it isn't fundamentally a commercial entity. It's trying to serve lots of different purposes. A shift from that to commercial space stations. And it's still a very uncertain thing. We're not exactly sure how it's going to happen or when, but there are multiple companies working on designs that NASA will be an anchor customer for that will be very much built to service potential commercial applications, whether that's R&D for things like pharmaceuticals or manufacturing for materials where the microgravity available in low Earth orbit is particularly valuable. And so if there are engineers out there, folks who build products where you think, actually, now that I think about it, having a microgravity environment where I'm not getting the sedimentation, but in fact all the things are diffusing in sort of more of a cloud, or where I can build things without buttressing them, like human organs and things like this. These are the ideas people are having. They're old ideas that we've been having them for decades, but we've never quite had the platform to make the most of this. And so that's a really exciting area in kind of the medium term. And then can
Interesting.
I just, yeah,
Yeah, one
and
more.
then
Go
maybe I'll
ahead.
just go even further out. So
Okay.
like, because part of how I think I'm sure your listeners who are excited about space, they're excited about the big visions of us living in space and expanding and exploring. I mean, especially given what your podcast is all about. And
Mhm.
um, I think there's a lot of variation of opinion on this, I will say, within the space sector, what role humans will play physically in our expansion into space. I tend to be more on the pro-human side. There are folks who think automation is definitely is a better way to explore. I tend to think we want to have people up there. And if we are going to have people up there, it's very complicated and dangerous and risky. And so we're going to need a ton of innovation on what you might think of as life support broadly defined,
Right.
food, shelter, safety, health, all sorts of things. So anybody who has ideas or interests in helping us survive in space and thrive in space, there's going to be huge opportunities there going forward.
Yeah, I imagine
Right.
there's certain alloys or ways to protect ourselves from radiation. That would be a game changer.
Exactly. Radiation is a huge issue. And, we have some ways of solving it, like you can live inside lava tubes and you can cover your habitats in regolith from Mars, but those aren't the most appealing ways to live, right? So
Right.
you'd love to have a bit of more ideas coming down the pipe. Yeah.
Well, Jeff Bezos is a big fan of O'Neill cylinders, which are basically these
Exactly.
cylinders that they need to have some sort of protection. You can't live under a lava rock there. So
Yes.
there's got to
The
be a solution in the actual materials.
I think that's right. I mean, the closer you are to Earth, the more you can still benefit from our magnetosphere shooting some of that radiation off. And that's actually part of the appeal of, building stations and then eventually, hopefully, larger stations that turn into hotels and maybe even habitats close to Earth. But you're right. As we think about the really long-term visions, that's the radiation is just one of the problems we're going to need to solve. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real game changer if we can somehow solve that thing. Now, what about when you were researching this book? You were not
Yeah.
ignorant. You knew already a lot about space and that kind of stuff. You weren't born yesterday, so you knew all these things. But then you always discover something new in the course of doing the research. What kind
Mm.
of like was like, oh wow, I didn't know that. What kind of moment did you have when you did that?
There's so many things, right? As you're actually reading this, it's even or writing this, and it's hard maybe even to notice them in retrospect,
Hmm.
because it's all part of the process. I guess let me highlight a couple things that come to mind. And I should tell people it's true that I was familiar with space, but actually
A Star
I've not
Trek
always been
junkie.
a space person. Yeah, exactly. That's the funny thing. So I'm an economist. I was trained in economics, and I've been teaching about economic policy and the role of government in markets at HBS for 15 years. And I only really started getting even mildly interested in space professionally about 10 years ago. And this is when SpaceX starts landing rockets on barges in the ocean, and everyone starts paying attention to these incredible transformations that are happening in space. And as an economist, seeing this shift in the role of the public versus the private sector, that's what we are all about. Economists have a lot of tools, a lot of knowledge about understanding the relative role of markets and states. And I thought, wait, maybe there's something I can do to understand this sector and maybe even help it do better. So that's how I got into space, and I've learned a lot about it just because I was curious and I wanted to help. And so that's the background of all this. When you ask what I learned that I think surprised me most, um, one thing that pops into my mind is that there's this paradox with space that it's obviously very big. It's sort of an understatement, but it's very big in multiple ways, not just physically, also potentially economically. Like we all hope that it really is, the subtitle of our book is unlocking the final economic frontier. We do hope that it's this unlimited frontier economically, and that's exciting because it makes you think that even the competitors in space, what you might think of as competitors in space right now, are also really collaborators. We're all trying to build this future together, and that's a wonderful thing. But it's also space is also remarkably small, and I mean that both in terms of the number of people involved in space. You meet one person in space, you meet another person, they already know each other. I mean, it's just a remarkably tight-knit community and very, very, I find, mutually supportive. But also the number of really serious players in space is actually quite small. So the number of countries that have big space programs, the number of companies that are really active is pretty limited.
There's even a third thing that is pretty
Yeah,
amazing, which is how small the Lagrange points are, like the L1,
that's
L2.
right.
That's a small real estate. The South Pole and the North Pole of the Moon, which are
Of the
going to be
moon,
heavily
exactly.
contested. I mean, these are tiny little areas, relatively speaking, compared to obviously the size of our solar system. These are,
Yes.
but they're very valuable real estate, and there's going to be some sort of bumping of elbows in those really valuable spots.
Yep. And you're so right. And that's a very much of a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, you do worry when things are limited that there is natural conflict over them. It's a similar problem. Most of your listeners have probably heard about the space debris problem in
Yes.
low Earth orbit, right? And you might think, like, and there is a real problem there that we only have one low Earth orbit, so to speak. And if we mess it up, it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort to clean it up and make it useful again. So that's a big risk. The other side of that coin is that when you have only a few major actors, their incentives to fix these problems and resolve them to actually capture the value are huge,
Right.
right? So um, SpaceX and Amazon, who are the ones that are likely to have the largest satellite constellations, they have every interest in low Earth orbit not becoming a useless debris field, right? They really want to make sure that it doesn't happen. Same with the moon. As much as there's competition over these special spots, we don't want to we don't want to ruin them in some sense, geopolitically or otherwise, in a way that then would um, destroy that value for all of us. There's a huge amount of aligned incentives in the end.
Absolutely. Now, I love your book. Really, I recommend it for everybody to go out there and buy it. I think you go to economicsofspace.com to learn more, right?
That's great. Yeah, you can go
Yeah.
there. It's also just you can find it on Amazon for
Right.
Space to Grow. Yeah, either way.
The book is, generally optimistic and that kind of stuff, but it was that whole space debris thing, which is related to the Kessler syndrome,
Yeah.
that especially at the very end of your book, Matt, where you interviewed a couple of people
Oh
and
yeah.
those experts, and then in the Q&A, the thing that kept coming up is that Kessler syndrome could be like
Yeah.
kind of keep us here on Earth.
Yeah.
Because if you imagine just a debris field all over, we can't even launch satellites safely because it's just a shit show up in the sky. This is a real
Yeah.
concern. And what surprised me, and this is, I'm an optimist. So I'm like, we'll deal with that, no problem. But
Yeah.
when I was listening to these experts that you interviewed and you put in your Q&A at the end of the book, it's they were kind of morbid about the whole idea. Like, oh, this is going to be kind of a tough nut to crack, and it may be a high probability it's going to give us some real headaches. What do you think?
First of all, thank you very much for the nice words about the book and also for reading all the way to the end. That's pretty great. It's
Nobody
not,
does that anymore. Well,
I
I
was going to
skipped to
say
the end.
that's
I'm
a
just
rare
kidding.
thing. Yeah, right. Look, it's funny you ask about this because as I mentioned, I didn't come to space originally and I was teaching about economics and I wanted to teach about climate change and the difficulty of solving this, tragedy of the commons problem that we're all facing. And then I learned about space debris and I thought, wait a minute, that's a beautiful analogy for the challenge we face with climate, but it gets at it from a different angle. And I think that's really the fundamental challenge that these experts and most people are worried about, which is that we all understand the risk, but it is this um, it's a classic tragedy of the commons where the negative spillover effects of my actions on others, I don't necessarily have to pay for them. And
Right.
because we don't have a global government that can help price those spillovers, because in fact, it's just hard to coordinate activity. It's hard to even sign responsibility for the debris because when my piece of debris hits your piece of debris, is it then your fault or my fault or the person's fault before? There's all these logistical problems to tackle it in a way that would, of course, we all would want to. And that's where people get very nervous, that it's not clear exactly the path through which we're going to get there. I have to say, maybe I'm just an optimist like you. I came away from all of this not quite as nervous as some, and maybe it's also the economics training in me, and this relates a little bit to what I just said earlier, which is it is very much in the interest of these concentrated players in space to not let the worst case happen, and you do start to see at least some evidence of the what we would really need to have happen, which is this building of norms, right? So that like if I'm going to be a responsible actor in space, I'm going to take care of my stuff. And if everybody expects that of everybody else, that's the sort of coordination that can happen and I think keep us away from the worst versions of this scenario as we develop technology to clean it up and to monitor it better. And you're starting to see some evidence of that. that makes me at least more hopeful maybe
Yeah,
than some of the others.
I think you covered a company that actually is going to try to solve the Kessler syndrome
Yeah.
and try to clean up the space and make some money off of that. And also that brings up another issue: innovation. Sorry, the lucrative, infinite market that lies beyond,
Mhm.
our planet. That is a big tug, and also cleaning up the space in case we do screw things up and the Kessler syndrome becomes a
Yeah,
problem. The value of cleaning up that and coming up with innovative technology that helps clean things up will also be probably developed, and there'll be a huge incentive to clean up the mess that we might end up creating.
for sure. And that's one of my favorite stories in the whole book because the man who founded this company called Astroscale,
Yes.
he was like so many of us and probably your listeners too, where he wasn't a space executive, he wasn't an aerospace engineer, he was an IT consultant, and then he founded his own software firm and sold that for a bit of money, so he had a bit of money to invest. And he said he was in his early 40s, and he said, "I really want to make an impact. Like what is out there where I can really." Go for broke basically and really swing for the fences, so to speak. And he started going to space conferences because he'd always had this interest in space. And he saw them talking about this debris problem and not really having a solution. And he's like, wait a minute, maybe I could help there. And so he starts this company, which now has hundreds of employees. It's raised over $100 million in venture financing. It's just an amazing story. I mean, they will obviously not be able to solve the problem on their own. It's just one company. But I do think that they've made a major difference in raising awareness and pushing towards this responsible norm of space activity. And I think he has already made a huge impact in the sector, and it's a lovely story.
And it's amazing. Now, speaking about a lovely story, we all have these lovely visions of what space will be like,
Yeah.
right? We imagine, all sorts, and there's popular imagination fueled by science fiction, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What is something that you think most people got wrong? In other words, probably won't happen.
Hmm.
Is there anything that you just says, it's
Yeah.
probably not going to take off?
Well, there's so many. Like the space elevator always comes up. So
Okay.
right, like people are very excited, and I, of course, too. There was a 6 month period where I thought this has got to be the solution to all of our problems, and then
Yes.
actually, when you dig in, it's probably just way, way off in the future,
Yes. Hundreds
technologically.
of
So
years, maybe.
yeah, so there's various things like that where they are more on the sci-fi realm, and of course, yeah,
But
go ahead. Yeah.
but the moon and maybe even Mars, with Phomos and Deimos, they're two little tiny
Hmm.
planets around Mars. But certainly the moon, a space elevator, we could without use like I think Kevlar, I think something like that. In other words, we have the technology to do the moon because the gravity is so low that theoretically we could do
Right.
have a moon space elevator. But for Earth, my
From
God,
Earth.
that thing is definitely at least a century away and probably several centuries.
Probably, yeah. And I think you mentioned the O'Neill cylinders before, which
Hmm.
if your audience isn't as familiar with them, that Gerard O'Neill was a professor at Princeton in the 70s who actually interestingly was Jeff Bezos's professor,
Yes.
which is a nice
Yes.
connection.
Yes.
And inspired Jeff Bezos and many, many others about the infinite possibility of tens of thousands of people living in these spinning colonies in space. And look, I think we'll eventually be there. I hope
Yes.
we'll eventually be there. But again, it's not
Centuries.
going to happen. Yeah, it's not going to happen soon, and that's okay. I mean, I think space is that it needs. I hope very much that we retain this balance of purpose and passion and dreaming with the pragmatic and the business minded in space. I think that's part of what really makes it all go around.
And that brings up planetary resources, something that I
Yeah.
think Diamantis helped fund.
Hmm.
This was at least 10 years ago. And it sounded like such a perfect business school idea. Like, hey, there's a bunch of
Yeah.
valuable minerals in asteroids. Let's just go get the asteroids, mine them, and either bring them back to space, but probably more likely use them to like build structures in space or
Hmm.
on the moon.
Hmm.
To me, makes more sense than bringing them all the way back to Earth. But that floundered. It failed. Why did it fail? And it kind of reminds me one more thing.
Yeah.
Marco Ianciti, who was a professor at
Yeah.
HBS,
Yeah.
he was my professor, and I gave him this brochure that my dad he bought stock in a company called Aerocar in the late 1950s. And
Hmm.
basically, it was a car that you attach wings to, and it flew, and it was FAA approved.
No
It actually
way.
worked.
Oh
And
my
and
gosh.
and this is just I gave it to Marco just to say, hey, this is a symbol of sometimes we're a bit ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's exact. I'm so glad you said that. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Um, when you were asking your question about planetary resources, I just a bit ahead of the curve. So I think it was a failure in some absolute sense, in the sense that the company didn't survive or it was bought for very little value in the end. And there's lots of, I mean, maybe lots of reasons for that. Just to back up a step, I think your instinct that the value out there in terms of resources, either for bringing them back here for rare and relatively light resources and very valuable ones, or for their more broad use in space. And this could be for building infrastructure on planets. It could be for building O'Neill cylinders. It could be for all sorts of things, providing fuel at fuel depots in space. There's a ton of, well, I think essentially astronomical value of those resources out there. And basically everybody agrees there are a couple of obstacles. Technologically, of course, is the most important one. Like it's actually pretty hard to go get this stuff and very expensive, which makes the business case harder to close. And that's the sense in which planetary and I think also deep space industries, which was at the same time both trying to do the same sorts of things, were just a little bit ahead of a little bit early. The technology wasn't as developed as it is now. It was much more expensive to get to space. And so they just were a little early. There's a new company now called Astroforge, and they're trying to take another shot at it in this generation. And maybe they'll be more successful. But the one thing I would say is I think those efforts by Planetary Resources and Deep Space were not, we shouldn't think of them as failures entirely, in the sense that what they did do is establish a property rights regime for the ability to go mine resources in space that was passed into law in the United States in 2015. And that removed a huge source of uncertainty for investors and for future activity on the resource extraction side.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, it reminds me how difficult space is. I think Jeff Bezos, but others have said that um, Antarctica is pretty much empty. We have a few
Yeah.
research stations there, but Antarctica is so much better than Mars
Yeah.
or the moon. I mean,
Yes.
and yet we're barely there. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's like it's a short flight away. It's got oxygen. It's got the gravity of the Earth. It's got water and like ice everywhere. I mean, it's just like it's so
Yeah.
much better, and yet we're barely scratching. And so imagine the challenges of going to the moon or Mars. What do you think? How do you think, as far as timeline, as when
Mm.
NASA plans to have a permanent space station at the end of this decade? Do you think that's happening? And what about Mars? Do you still? A lot of people are saying the 2030s. Do you agree that we'll get boots on the ground and maybe a minor station there?
Yeah, so great. So and it's a question I get all the time, right? Which is why are we even doing this, honestly? Like
Mm.
it seems scary and dangerous, and it's not even clear exactly what the value is of this kind of exploration. Obviously, the satellite stuff, we can see how it
Mm.
directly impacts Earth. Like it makes a huge difference in all of our lives these days, having GPS and satellite communications and climate monitoring, and there is so much good and value that's created for humans on Earth from space. Why don't we stick with that? Why don't we focus our efforts on those things? And I think there's a good case to be made for that being our priority. On the other hand, there there is, I think, this inevitable pull into space that taps into something very deep in us. And I would never want to suppress that all the way in this sector. In fact, I'd like to encourage it because I think it draws talent into the sector. It draws purpose and fire. If you think about SpaceX, the single most successful commercial space company in history,
Mm.
its core mission, and when you talk to people who work at SpaceX, the mission that is drummed into them from the first day they're on site is we are going to Mars because
Yep.
we are making humans a multiplanetary species. And so it's not just talk. That is truly the mission. And I think it pulls them in a way that it otherwise might not towards really ambitious goals and efficiency. So all to say that yes, I do actually think those forecasts are essentially the timing is pretty close to what I would expect. The space, there is some uncertainty about the stations, whether it turns out we will commit to being able to keep astronauts permanently in space. So there's no gap between the end of the ISS and the commercial stations. There's some debate about that. But I think that we will certainly have the capability to have astronauts orbiting Earth continuously. So that would imply commercial stations at least in the early 2030s. And then Mars, I see no reason to doubt that SpaceX is absolutely serious in its desire to get people landed on Mars in the next, 15 to 20 years. I hope certainly in my lifetime that we will see that, and I think I expect it. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Now, you collaborated on your book with Brendan Rousseau, and
Yep.
what did you guys want to be like the key message from your book, Space to
Mm,
Grow? Is there a certain thing that you want people to have a takeaway and say, this is the most important thing? If
well,
you learn one thing,
yeah,
what should it be?
thank you, Francis. That's such a great question. The what we really hope readers learn is that the big thing that has changed in space, the transformation in space right now, is that market forces are playing a role in space that they never have before. That's the big change. And that means that space is opened up to so many more people, so many more organizations and companies to get involved, to be a part of this incredible moment that we happen to be
Mm,
alive for,
yeah.
to be part of something truly extraordinary. And so we are really hoping that this is as much as anything a call to action for more people to seize this moment and see what they might do with space for themselves and their organizations.
So you're going to right after this call, you're going to have a class at
Yeah.
HBS,
Yeah.
and you've got a bunch of potential and future entrepreneurs. What would you advise them? If they're saying, "Okay, I want to go into the
Yeah.
space industry." We talked at the very beginning about potential low hanging fruit. Any other gotchas or things that you would say, in your business plan or in your business ideas,
Hmm.
be careful about X, Y, Z. What would that be?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing, and this is maybe a
By
little,
the way, this is a
yeah,
very capital intensive things you would
it is.
think, but maybe there's a way to like reduce those capital requirements. But it seems like, wow, that's one of the big impediments.
So it's a good, actually, that's a great, let me just address that quickly, which is that one of the great things about space becoming more of just a business, a normal business, rather
Right.
than sort of a government contracting Lockheed Martin and Northrop and just the big legacy primes, is that there are now lots and more places for people to fit in with their niche applications, some of which aren't particularly capital intensive. So we have a startup that came out of HBS just a couple of years ago called Stell, and it's
Mm,
basically a software company. They basically help space companies manage their procurement processes and their manufacturing processes more efficiently and do it better than the old systems that were available when these students were in these industries. And so that's not particularly capital intensive, but they're making
yeah.
a big difference, and it's awesome. Okay, so advice to entrepreneurs. First, this is maybe a little silly, but I would just say do it. Like,
Mm,
honestly, like stick your neck out there. This is such an exciting industry, and I
mm,
don't meet a single person who regrets being involved in the sector. And it's not easy. You might stumble. If you can take the risk, I guess, with your, personal finances or your life stage of life you're at, it's a wonderful industry to be a part of. So that's the first thing. The
mm,
second thing I'd say is make sure if you're not a technical person, make sure you have a good technical partner.
mm,
Because as much as space is becoming more of a business, having that technical expertise is still essential. You've got to know what you're talking about, basically, to have a real impact. And the related point there is try to narrow your focus.
mm,
So talk to folks in the public sector and the private sector because both are still going to be perpetual sources of funding and business, whether it's national security or civilian work for the government or whether it's commercial work, and have really in your mind what problem exactly are you solving for these people in the sector.
I've written a couple books, and every time, the
Yeah.
moment the book goes to press, you regret all sorts of things. You're like, I should have said this. I forgot to say that. It's
That's
like,
so
so
funny.
what would you? I mean, your book is coming out on the
Yep.
25th of February. I encourage
Yep.
everybody to get it. It's an amazing book. But is there anything that you would add? Maybe some new news that just
Yeah.
broke in the last in 2025.
Well, news does keep breaking. Luckily, nothing has broken in that sense that surprised us too much. I mean, of
Mm,
course, there's so much going on in American government right now, including
right.
space. So even by the time this airs, things may have changed that we didn't anticipate. The one thing I will say that we would love to have been able to put more in on and spend more time getting really ready to write about is more of the international dimension. So we
Mm,
have quite a bit in the book on national security and on cooperation across countries. But one of the most exciting things that's also happening is the development of space enterprises, you might say, in other countries. So just to take an example, India is making enormous strides in what it's doing on relatively limited funds with space. In fact, they just
yeah.
became the fourth country to dock two different assets in space. And so there's amazing progress happening there. And it's not just India. Many, many countries are getting excited about getting involved. So maybe it's the next book, I'm not sure, but we would love to have, it's a pretty US focused book at this point, and we'd love to have it more international.
Yes, but still, it is a broad sweep, and you cover so many companies. I read a lot about the industry, and I still learn so much about your book. So many companies, I was like, I didn't know about that company. I didn't know about that company. So it's a fantastic book, and it's easy to read, and yet it's has depth as well. So I highly encourage everybody to go out and get it, because a lot of people on this show, they're explorers. They're people who love to explore, and I'm jealous of Magellan and Columbus and all these guys who got to explore the world. And basically, in the 25th century, people are going to be jealous of us.
Yeah, there you go.
Saying, I wish you had lived in the 21st century. It was such an epic age. They were just getting off the earth and exploring. So it's a great time to go. Remind people where they can learn more about the book.
Well, thank you so much, Francis. So yes, www.economicsofspace.com is one place where you can learn about the book, and also about all the research we're doing at HBS and other faculty besides myself who are involved in trying to help this sector move forward from a business standpoint. And then, of course, our book is also available on Amazon. So Space to Grow.
And your co-author, Brendan Rousseau, and I should be having a conversation ideally soon. So subscribe to the WanderLearn show so you can hear his co-author, Matt's co-author, refute everything that Matt said. No.
That's right. Actually, it is part of the fun, right? If you write a book with somebody, where do you differ on some of these issues? And Brendan and I have had so many great conversations wrestling those issues to the ground. Yeah.
In 2 minutes, any advice to people who are thinking about co-authoring a book? What kind of advice would you give to somebody who wants to be a co-author? And how do you collaborate effectively with a co-author? It's a tricky thing.
So, I mean, one of the great benefits Brendan and I had is we had worked together before we decided to write the book. So, as part of my work at HBS, we write case studies to teach in class. We had developed a course together. And so we'd worked up a great working relationship before we got settled on the book. And he was just a dream co-author. I'm incredibly lucky to have had him by my side. And I think that, it is there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of division of labor that has to go into it. So I would establish the relationship in some other way first if you can.
Excellent. Matt, a pleasure. Thank you so much. And go get the book. I will have links to it in the show notes, and I highly recommend it. Space to Grow. Thank you, Matt. Have a wonderful time in space, wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Francis. What a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.